Anyone that knows me knows that I really like to do research. And for the last couple of years, I've actually done a lot of research on Ukraine, which I'd like to share with you. And I'm going to start by dispelling what I'm calling a pseudo-myth that is currently being circulated by the press. So what is the pseudo-myth? Well, it's being reported that Russia promised to never attack Ukraine if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. This is only partly true. Yes, Russia agreed to recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, but the nuclear weapons that supposedly Ukraine was going to give up didn't belong to Ukraine in the first place. So here's the background. In 1991, the people of the Soviet state of Ukraine voted to be an independent country, and they left the USSR. At the time, despite the fact that Ukraine did not have a nuclear program, it held about a third of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. Also at the time, Ukraine owed Russia, and I'm talking about Russia, not the USSR, they owed Russia a couple $2 billion, which were supposed to have been paid off by 1993. In 1993, Russia offered to forgive Ukraine's debt in exchange for returning Russia's nuclear weapons and to return Ukraine's share of the Black Sea Fleet. But Ukraine refused. By the way, the headquarters for the Black Sea Fleet is in Crimea, which you need to remember, it'll be important later on. And also, when the USSR broke up, the Black Sea Fleet was split between Russia and Ukraine. So you may be asking yourself, was that a very fair offer by the Russians? I happen to think it was, and for several reasons. First of all, the year before, in 1992, all the former Soviet states that had Soviet nuclear weapons had signed an agreement to honor the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as START, that had been signed between the USSR and the USA. This would have meant that had Ukraine accepted the offer from Russia, the cost of disarming the weapons would have fallen on Russia, not on Ukraine. The second reason is that all the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine were intercontinental ballistic weapons, kind of like in this video, which means that they were really only able to be aimed at the USA and the very far eastern parts of Russia or other places far away. And just in case you didn't know, Eastern Russia has really no strategic importance and very few people. The third reason is when the USSR broke up, the Russians were the ones that controlled the nuclear weapons. And when they left Ukraine, they took all their triggers with them. In case you didn't know this about explosives don't work well unless they have something. Actually, they don't work at all if you don't have a trigger to set them off. So even if Ukraine had tried to reactivate the weapons, it would have been noticed, and then Ukraine would have been in big doo-doo with the world. So yeah, the weapons were pretty much useless. And lastly, Ukraine couldn't afford to maintain its share of the Black Sea Fleet anyway. In fact, by 2009, Ukraine only had one ship capable of long-range missions. This is it. This is a picture of it. And the majority of the few ships the Navy did have were mostly river patrol boats, or ships, whatever they want to call it. So why didn't Ukraine take the offer to pay off its billions in debt? The answer is simple: PR. In 1994, at a big ceremony televised across the entire world, Ukraine agreed to dismantle its useless and non-existent nuclear arsenal. And Ukraine also got money to give up its useless nuclear weapons. So here's an analogy. It's like if a friend knew you didn't like chocolate because it triggers migraines. And yes, there are people that don't like chocolate, but they make you a chocolate cake, and then they expect you to not only pay for the cake, but they also ask you to promise to always be their friend. Oh, and they make you do it in front of all of your friends. Yeah, I'd probably be nice and say thank you and promise to be your friend. And I'd even mean it. Until you prove repeatedly you're not my friend, then I'm probably going to get mad. By the way Ukraine handled the weapons is an example of how Ukraine is going to handle a lot of the situations in the future. But before I continue, I think I'm going to put some disclaimers into this video now. So back in 2019, when the whole Trump-Ukraine quid pro quo came out, I have to admit I felt pretty betrayed. So I did what I do, which is to do a lot of research. And an awful lot of that research had, as I already mentioned, had to do with Ukraine. One of the things I learned was that corruption is not Ukraine's middle name, it's Ukraine's first name and last name. Up until I think 2019, it was definitely the most corrupt country in Europe, even more corrupt than Russia. Now, I think starting in about 2019 and 2020, we don't have the numbers for 2021 yet, it is the second most corrupt after Russia, but it's still very corrupt. So consequently, when everything happened recently, I had to sit back and go, I need to learn more about this war that's going on right now. Because you know what? I am not going to trust anything that's coming out of Ukraine. And I'm not going to trust anything that's coming out of Russia. Please, please do not think anything that I am saying is in any way justifying or supporting what Putin is doing in Ukraine right now. I do not. He is an evil person and an evil man. But at the same time, because war is so horrendous, we have a responsibility to make educated, unbiased decisions to not only limit human suffering now, but also for the future. After all, it was the revengeful Versailles Treaty after World War I that provided the ammunition for Hitler to lead Germany into World War II. I cannot imagine anything more tragic than if the mistakes of the early 20th century were repeated with nuclear weapons. By the way, these war pictures that are scrolling by, 3/4 of them are not from the current war in Ukraine. They're from the ongoing civil war from 2014 that has been happening in Ukraine. My point being, the situation in Ukraine is far too complex to allow ourselves to repeat a mob mentality like what we saw with the Nicholas Sandmann fiasco. I can certainly understand people having a strong emotional response when they hear the stories coming out of Ukraine now. But where was that concern prior to 2022? The Ukraine Civil War, which began in 2014, has already killed over 14,000 people and has displaced 1.5 million people. I'm going to address whether the Civil War is justified or not in a different video, in a separate video. But for this video, I'm going to ask you to have an open mind and offer you a really overly simplistic explanation of the war. Basically, in 2014, some Ukrainians decided they preferred corrupt Ukrainians as their leaders, and others decided they preferred corrupt pro-Russian leaders. They couldn't compromise, so there was a civil war. I'm not really sure if the Ukrainians could have settled the civil war themselves, but the U.S., Europe, and Russia did get involved, so who knows. But like I said, it's pretty complicated, so I'm going to cover most of the Civil War in the next video. It is being suggested, or flatly stated, that Putin started this and he had no provocation to invade Russia. Well, I don't really think that's entirely true. You see, in early March of last year, Zelensky closed down 3 Ukrainian opposition broadcasting stations. By that I mean they opposed Zelensky. And on March 24th, he signed a Ukraine security decree imposing sanctions on 8 other media and TV stations who opposed him also. Then, over the next 2 weeks, Zelensky and the Ukraine Security Council put sanctions on the head of the opposition party leader. So that'd be like, arresting Pelosi and throwing her in jail, which in May, Zelensky had his opposition arrested and charged with treason. Although truthfully, in Ukraine, charging your opponent with treason is as common as how many times Rachel Maddow could say Russia when Trump was president. So, with his opposition accused of treason, or cut off from their money, or silenced, well, all of them were silenced, Zelensky signed a decree stating that Ukraine would make it a policy to take back Crimea and make Russia pay compensation for any damages caused by the occupation. This declaration was recognized by many experts as a threat against Russia's most important warm water port, which could lead to a full-scale war. Then, about 2 weeks after arresting everybody and closing everybody down, on April 4th, Ukraine announced joint military exercise with NATO that would be occurring in July of 2021. And this is what the statement read. In particular, defensive actions will be worked out, followed by an offensive in order to restore the state boundary and territorial integrity of a state that has been subjected to aggression by one of the hostile neighboring countries. This announcement basically did not pull any punches and further supported Ukraine's claim it was going to put a stop to the civil war, which would have meant basically stopping Russia from helping. It wouldn't stop anybody else from helping. America and the West could keep helping Ukraine, but Russia couldn't. Anyway, following each one of Zelensky's actions, Russia responded by announcing military exercise of its own. So I think, I guess the question here would be, who drew first blood? Thanks for listening to this. The next two videos will be, the first one is going to be on the history of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia since the fall of the USSR. And then the last video is going to be on the cultural and ethnic makeup of the area, basically where the civil war is taking place. I think it's very important to understand the cultural differences to explain and understand how this conflict has come about. But again, thank you so very much for listening. Bye-bye.